When we gather in the intimacy of reflection, it is not merely to listen to words, but to encounter the very soul of our wounds. Tonight, I speak to you of the hidden wound that so many carry unknowingly, a wound that is not born of their own mistakes, but woven into them through the psychic fabric of their lineage. It is the wound of the empath, the one who has silently carried the shadow of the parent. And though we speak in the language of psychology, what is opened here is not a technical analysis, but a descent into the mystery of the human soul, where symbols, archetypes, and the unspoken burdens of generations converge. Every child, before it learns to speak, it feels its first communion with the world is not in words, but in atmospheres, in tensions that hang invisibly in the household, in the whispered anxieties behind a mother's gaze, in the unspoken anger within a father's silence. The child absorbs it as though it were air. But here lies the great danger. The child does not yet know what belongs to itself and what belongs to the other. It drinks in the psychic currents of the parent as if they were its own blood. And if the parent carries unresolved wounds, unintegrated shadows, the child often becomes the vessel into which those shadows are silently poured. You may ask, why the empath? Why does this particular soul become the one who absorbs? The answer lies in the archetype of the healer. The empath is marked by a heightened sensitivity, a psychic antenna that is tuned to the emotional frequencies of others. In another time, this sensitivity would be a sacred gift, the very capacity that allows the healer, the shaman, the mystic, to perceive what others cannot. But in the crucible of the family, before the gift matures into wisdom, it becomes a curse, for the empath does not yet discern boundaries. The empath feels what the parent does not express. The empath becomes the silent carrier of sorrows unspoken. This is the hidden wound. A father unable to face his own failures unconsciously lays them upon the son, who begins to feel the weight of inadequacy as if it were his own. A mother haunted by abandonment unconsciously places the fear of being left upon the daughter, who grows up with an unexplainable terror of rejection. The child does not know this grief, this shame, this fear. It is not mine, and yet it bleeds through the empath's heart as though it were born from within. You see, the psyche does not operate on the logic of the intellect. It lives through symbols, through resonance, through the mysterious threads that bind unconscious to unconscious. When a parent represses, the child dreams. When the parent denies, the child feels. This is the transference of shadow across generations. And because it is unspoken, because it is unconscious, it remains hidden even to the one who carries it. The empath grows into adulthood, sensing that something is wrong, that there is a heaviness lodged in the soul, but unable to name it. They speak of anxiety, of depression, of an emptiness that cannot be filled. And behind these words is the truth. They have been carrying another shadow all along. Now, do not misunderstand. The shadow of the parent is not evil in itself. It is not a curse cast, deliberately. It is simply the unintegrated, the grief that was too much for them to face, the rage that was too dangerous to express, the shame that was too unbearable to speak. These fragments sink into the unconscious like stones into deep water, and the empathic child, by a cruel grace, becomes the diver who swims down and holds them. Think of the dream in which one wanders through a house, not their own, walking into rooms filled with strange objects, dark corners, locked doors. This dream belongs not to the child, but to the parent, and yet the child finds himself inside it. How often have you felt that your life was haunted by scenes you did not live, by terrors that did not originate in your own story? This is the inheritance of shadow. It is not merely genetic, it is psychic. But why, you ask, would the soul accept such a burden? Why would the empath be chosen for this silent work? Perhaps because the archetype of the wounded healer is always born through suffering. One does not become a true healer by reading books or reciting formulas, but by bearing wounds that force the soul to confront the mystery of life. The empath who carries the parent's shadow is unknowingly being initiated into the vocation of transformation, for the burden that nearly crushes them is also the doorway to the alchemy of the soul. Let me explain. The shadow that is carried is not meant to remain unconscious forever. It cries for integration, and the empath, in awakening to the recognition that this is not mine, begins the sacred process of differentiation. The self begins to discern between what belongs to the personal soul and what belongs to the ancestral lineage. This moment is like the first breath of freedom. It is as if a fog begins to lift and one realizes that the shame they have carried like a chain is not the truth of their being, but the ghost of another's unfinished work. This is why so many empaths live their early years with a profound confusion of identity. They become mirrors, reflecting what others project, and yet their own image is blurred. They are praised for being kind, for being sensitive, for being accommodating. But beneath the surface, they are exhausted, drained, uncertain of where they end. And the other begins. This is not empathy, it is possession. It is the shadow of the parent living through the child. I recall a woman who once came to me in great despair. She spoke of her inability to find peace in relationships, of always feeling abandoned no matter how much love she received. As we worked, it became clear that her mother had lived with a wound of abandonment, left by her own father at a young age. This wound was never spoken, but it was alive, vibrating through the household. The daughter absorbed it before she even had language. For years, she mistook it as her own truth. I am destined to be left. Only when she recognized that she was carrying her mother's shadow could she begin to release it. And in that recognition, a great weight fell from her, as if a chain had been broken. The hidden wound is always tied to silence. What is not spoken, what is not acknowledged, becomes the phantom that haunts the child's psyche. The empath is like the dreamer in the family dream. sensing what others deny, embodying what others repress. This is why their suffering is often invisible to others. They are praised for being strong, for enduring, for always being there. But no one sees that they are drowning in shadows that were never theirs. Here, we must pause, for this is not merely personal, it is collective. The empath who carries the shadow of the parent is also carrying the shadow of the lineage. The ancestral wounds that pass like invisible threads through generations, wars, betrayals, unspoken traumas, forbidden desires, all of these echo through the bloodline, and the empath, sensitive as a tuning fork, resonates with these echoes. In this sense, the empath is not just a child of their parents, but a vessel for the whole ancestral story. This is why the healing of the empath is never just for themselves. When they awaken, when they return the shadow to its rightful place, when they integrate what was denied, they liberate not only their own soul, but also the souls of those who came before. They break the chain of unconscious inheritance. They become the one through whom the lineage breathes again. But let me also warn, this path is not easy. To recognize that you have been carrying another's shadow is to face a deep sorrow, for it means acknowledging that those who were meant to protect you, tonuture you, were themselves broken, unable to bear their own darkness. It awakens both grief and compassion, and yet it also awakens power, the power to separate, to stand as oneself, to no longer be the unconscious vessel of another's fate. So, when you feel the weight of emotions that seem disproportionate, when you sense that you are haunted by fears that do not belong to your own life, pause and ask, whose shadow am I carrying? This question is the beginning of liberation. For to name the wound is to bring it into consciousness, and what is conscious can be transformed. We are only at the threshold of this mystery. In the next unfolding, I will take you deeper into how the empath can discern the difference between their own soul and the shadow of the parent, how dreams, symbols, and the unconscious itself guide this process of separation, and how the wound, once acknowledged, becomes the very seed of healing not only for the individual, but for the entire lineage that flows through them. To move deeper into this labyrinth, we must listen not only to the outer narrative, but to the inner symbols that arise when one dares to confront the shadow. For the shadow of the parent, carried by the empathic child, reveals itself not in obvious statements, but in images, in dreams, in inexplicable emotions that rise like specters from the depths. The unconscious speaks in riddles, in archetypal language, and if we wish to understand what has been inherited, we must learn to hear that tongue. Imagine a man who, night after night, dreams of carrying a heavy sack upon his shoulders. He does not know its contents, only that it slows his every step, and no matter how he tries to lay it down, it clings to him as though fused to his body. When he comes to me, he speaks of exhaustion, of a weariness that no rest relieves. And as we journey together, it becomes clear The sack is the grief of his father, a grief never expressed, never mourned, buried beneath stoicism and silence. The son, tuned to the father's unspoken sorrow, took it upon himself without knowing his dream, then is the psyche's way of showing him the burden is not his. Such dreams are common in empaths. They dream of carrying, of drowning, of being bound, of wandering in strange places filled with relics that do not belong to them. These are not random fancies. They are the symbolic landscapes of the borrowed shadow. And when the empath begins to interpret these dreams, not as prophecies of doom, but as messages from the unconscious, a doorway opens, for the unconscious does not only reveal the wound, it reveals the path of liberation. The empath must first recognize the sacred distinction. What belongs to me? And what belongs to the other? This is not a cold intellectual separation, but a psychic act of untangling the ego when unawakened is like a sponge, soaking all that surrounds it. But when consciousness rises, it becomes like a flame, discerning, illuminating what is true and what is foreign. To say, this fear is not mine, is already to reclaim a piece of the soul. Yet this is no simple declaration, for the empath has often built an entire identity around the wound. They believe themselves to be anxious, weak, unworthy, not realizing that these are masks they were forced to wear. The shadow of the parent becomes the costume of the child. And so, when asked to take it off, they resist, for beneath it, they feel naked, uncertain of who they are without it. This is why healing feels at first like death. It is the death of a false self, the crumbling of a persona that was never authentic but always borrowed. Here the archetype of the descent arises like Persephone into the underworld, like Christ into the tomb. The empath must go down into the darkness, not to be consumed, but to discover the soul that was buried there. In facing the wound, in naming it, they discover that the shadow is not an enemy, but a teacher. It shows them where they were entangled, where their boundaries dissolved, where their soul became enmeshed with another's fate. And in that seeing, they begin to separate. Consider the image of the mirror. The child, in the earliest years, gazes into the parent as into a mirror, searching for reflection, for recognition. But when the parent is consumed by their own shadow, the mirror is clouded. Instead of seeing their own face, the child sees fragments of the parent's darkness. They mistake it for themselves. Healing begins when the empath cleanses the mirror and dares to look again, asking, who am I apart from this? This is the act of individuation, the sacred path of becoming one's true self. Distinct from the inherited images and shadows, but this path requires courage, for to separate from the parent's shadow is to confront guilt. The empath feels that to release the burden is to betray the parent, to abandon them in their weakness. And yet, the paradox is that only by releasing what is not theirs can they truly love the parent. To carry their shadow unconsciously is not love, it is fusion, it is possession. True love is born when one can see the parent clearly, shadow and all, and yet remain oneself. I recall a young man who carried his mother's anxiety as though it were his very heartbeat. She had been abandoned in her youth, and her fear of losing love was etched into every gesture. The son, sensitive to her trembling, absorbed it so deeply that he could not rest in any relationship. He would chase affection, terrified of rejection, even when no threat was present. When he began to see that this fear was not born of his own experience but of his mother's, he wept. He wept not only for himself, but for her, for the little girl she once was, for the sorrow she had never spoken. In those tears, he released what was not his. He did not cease to love her. He loved her more truly. For now he saw her as she was, not as the phantom within himself. This is the essence of shadow work: to see, to name, to separate, and then to integrate. For even what is not ours teaches us. The empath, in carrying the parent's shadow, has been trained in the depths of compassion, in the capacity to sense the hidden currents of the soul. But this gift is distorted when unconscious. It becomes slavery. Only when conscious does it become healing. The empath, once awakened, no longer absorbs unconsciously, but chooses consciously when to open, when to feel, when to offer their presence. They become a master of sensitivity rather than its victim, and here is where the archetype of the wounded healer emerges in full. The very wound that nearly destroyed them becomes the source of their gift, for who can guide another through the labyrinths of inherited shadows except one who has walked it themselves? Who can sit with the unspoken grief of another except one who has borne such grief in their own bones? This is why the empath wound, though painful, is sacred. It is the initiation into a vocation that is larger than the personal, but let us not romanticize. The path is long and the danger is real, for many remain trapped, fused to the parent's shadow until the end of life, never discerning, never separating. They live as ghosts of another story, never inhabiting their own. To awaken requires both inner work and outer courage. It may mean setting boundaries that feel like betrayal, speaking truths that fracture illusions, stepping away from roles that once defined identity. It is a death and a rebirth, and yet, if you listen within, you will hear that this is what your soul has longed for. For the hidden wound cries not only with pain, but with yearning. It yearns to be seen, to be spoken, to be transformed. The empath exhaustion, their endless search for peace, their deep sensitivity, these are the signals of the soul calling them toward individuation. The burden was never meant to crush you. It was meant to awaken you. So when you sit in silence and feel the heavy emotions that rise unbidden, do not flee. Ask them, whose voice is this? Whose shadow do I carry? And then wait The unconscious will answer, not in sentences, but in images, in memories, in subtle recognitions that whisper, "This is not yours." In that moment, you stand at the threshold of freedom. We will go deeper still. For the empath, once awakened, does not merely release the shadow, they transmute it. They take what was unconscious in the lineage and bring it into the light. They become the alchemist of the family soul, turning sorrow into wisdom, fear into compassion, shadow into depth. This is not an easy gift, but it is a sacred one. And it is through this alchemy that the empath ceases to be a victim and becomes a vessel of transformation. The question that arises now is this: how does one live after such a revelation? When you recognize that much of your inner life has been shaped by shadows, not your own, when you see that the heaviness you have carried was borrowed, what does it mean for the path ahead? For here lies the true work of individuation, not only to awaken, but to re-inhabit the self that has long been hidden beneath inherited burdens. The first task is to recognize the difference between empathy and enmeshment. True empathy is a conscious act of opening to another's experience while retaining one's own center. Enmeshment, by contrast, is unconscious absorption, a loss of boundary in which one cannot tell where the other ends and the self begins. Most empaths, before awakening, live in the state of enmeshment. They confuse sensitivity with identity. They believe that to feel deeply is to lose themselves, when in truth, the gift of empathy is most powerful when it arises from a rooted self. Without that root, the empath is like a tree whose branches bend in every wind, never knowing its own trunk, and so the hidden wound must be healed by rooting. The empath must learn, often painfully, to return again and again to the question, what is mine? This is not selfishness. Though the old conditioning will whisper it, so it is necessity, for without this root, without this boundary, there is no true love, no true giving, only endless leaking of energy, a draining that leaves both giver and receiver impoverished. The empath, in reclaiming their own center, begins to see that love without boundaries is not love, it is sacrifice. And sacrifice, when unconscious, breeds resentment and exhaustion. The psyche teaches this truth through dreams. A woman once told me she dreamt of standing in a house filled with water, rushing from broken pipes. She was frantically trying to mop to save the furniture, but the water only rose higher. At last, she collapsed, defeated, the water up to her neck. This was no mere dream of household anxiety. It was her soul revealing the state of her boundaries. She was flooded by emotions that were not hers, consumed by the waters of her mother's despair, her partner's rage, her friend's needs. Only when she saw this image for what it was did she realize the task is not to mop endlessly, but to repair the pipe, to seal what is leaking. In waking life, this meant learning to say no, to distinguish between compassion and self-erasure. You see, the unconscious does not lie. It shows us in symbols the reality of our psychic state, and if the empath would heal, they must attend to these inner messages. They must ask of each dream, each emotion, is this mine, or is this another shadow moving through me? In time, they will develop a discernment that feels almost mystical. They will walk into a room and know instantly what belongs to them and what belongs to others, but unlike before, they will not confuse the two. They will sense without absorbing, understand without carrying. This is the birth of psychic sovereignty. Yet there is more. For once the empath begins to reclaim themselves, they discover that the shadow they carried was not only a burden but a map. Each inherited wound points toward an archetypal mystery. The mother's abandonment becomes an initiation into the archetype of the orphan, teaching the empath how to live with aloneness and to discover strength in solitude. The father's suppressed rage becomes an initiation into the warrior, teaching the empath how to wield anger not as destruction but as protection of what is sacred. The grandparent's grief becomes an initiation into the sage, teaching the empath to carry sorrow not as despair but as wisdom. In this way, the shadows that once crushed the soul are transmuted into archetypal guides. This is the alchemy of the unconscious. What is poison becomes medicine. What is wound becomes gift. When brought into consciousness, the empath, in undergoing this process, not only liberates themselves, but fulfills a task for the collective. For the unconscious of one is never isolated. We are all bound within the great web of the collective unconscious, and when one person integrates a shadow, it ripples outward into the whole. Thus, the empath's healing is not private, it is cosmic. Still, the path is not linear. At times, the empath will feel themselves slipping back, drowning again in borrowed emotions, haunted again by ancestral echoes. This is natural. The psyche moves in spirals, not straight lines. Each return to the wound is an opportunity to go deeper, to see more clearly, to embody the truth more fully. Do not despair when you fall back into the old patterns. They are not signs of failure, but invitations to refine the work. Each time you separate more gently, more firmly, you strengthen the root of your own soul. Now let us turn to a truth more difficult. The recognition of anger. Many empaths resist anger, believing it to be dangerous, destructive, unworthy of their sensitivity. But this is precisely why they are consumed by the shadows of others. Anger is the guardian of boundaries. Without it, the empath is defenseless. To reclaim one's anger is to reclaim one's right to exist as oneself, and yet, because the empath has often carried the parents' unexpressed rage, they fear that to express their own will be to unleash a monster. They must learn slowly that anger is not violence. It is the sacred fire that says, this is me and that is you. Without it, there can be no true separation, no true love. I remember a man who had never raised his voice in his life. He prided himself on being gentle, patient, endlessly accommodating, yet within he was hollowed out, drained, exhausted. In therapy, he dreamt of a lion pacing in a cage, roaring, furious at being trapped. When he finally allowed himself to feel his anger, not against the world, but as his own boundary, his life transformed. He began to say no. He began to choose for himself. He did not become cruel, he became real. And the lion was no longer a prisoner, but a protector. The empath must embrace this fire. Without it, they will forever be the carrier of another's shadow, never daring to step into their own light. With it, they become whole, and wholeness, as I have always taught, does not mean perfection. It means integration. It means holding within oneself both the light and the dark, both the inherited shadow and the reclaimed self, both compassion and anger, both sorrow and joy. Wholeness is not achieved by fleeing the shadow, but by embracing it, by saying, yes, this too belongs to the human soul. Only then is the empath free, not free from feeling, but free from being consumed by what does not belong to them. This freedom carries with it a paradoxical gift. Once the empath has healed the hidden wound, once they are no longer unconsciously fused with the parent's shadow, they can feel more deeply than ever before. But now their feeling is not slavery, it is power. They can walk into the sorrow of another without drowning. They can hold space for rage without being consumed. They can touch the ancestral wound without carrying it as their own. They become not victims, but healers, not sponges, but vessels, not shadows, but flames. And so, I tell you, the hidden wound is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the great transformation. To carry the parent's shadow is to begin in chains. To awaken is to break them. To integrate is to turn them into gold. This is the alchemy of the empath's soul, and it is among the most sacred tasks in the mystery of life. And now we arrive at the culmination of this journey, the place where the hidden wound is no longer seen as a prison but as a passage. For to be an empath, to carry the shadow of the parent, is not merely a story of suffering, it is the archetypal initiation into one of the deepest mysteries of the human soul, the reconciliation of shadow and light, the union of opposites, the rebirth of the true self through fire. You must understand that the unconscious is never cruel for its own sake. What it gives, even when it appears unbearable, is always a symbol of transformation. The empath's wound, though hidden, is precisely the crack through which light can enter. Without it, the empath might have lived a shallow life, untouched by depth, uninitiated into the mysteries. But by being forced to carry the unbearable, they are called into depths from the beginning, and it is this depth that gives their life meaning. Let me offer you an image. Imagine a vessel of clay passed from generation to generation, each ancestor leaving upon it an invisible mark, a crack, a wound. By the time it reaches you, it seems fragile, leaking, unfit to hold water. And yet, it is precisely through these cracks that the fire of the spirit can enter, hardening the vessel, making it stronger, more luminous than before. The Japanese speak of kintsugi, the art of mending broken pottery with gold so that the break becomes the place of beauty. So too with the empath, the wound, once healed, becomes the place of greatest radiance. The final task of the empath is not merely to release what is not theirs, but to integrate what they have learned through carrying it. For in bearing the parent's shadow, they have touched sorrows that are universal. Their compassion is no longer sentimental, it is born of fire. Their sensitivity is no longer confusion, it is mastery. Their soul has become like a vessel that has traveled to the underworld and returned, filled with wisdom that cannot be taught, only lived. Here is the paradox. The empath must lose themselves in order to find themselves. They must descend into the borrowed shadows, only to emerge with a self that is more authentic than if they had never carried them. This is why so many empaths, once healed, become healers themselves, not because they choose it as a profession, but because their very being has been forged into a vessel of healing. To sit with them is to feel seen, understood, accompanied, for they have walked the valley of shadows and returned. But let us speak plainly, the work is never finished. The empath will always feel the pull of others' sorrows, will always sense the undercurrents of pain and fear around them, but now they will know how to discern, how to choose, how to remain rooted even as they feel. They will know that their life is not defined by another's wound, but by their own wholeness. And this is freedom. What then becomes of the parent whose shadow was carried? This too is part of the mystery, for often when the empath awakens, when they release what is not theirs, a space opens for the parent as well. Sometimes, seeing their child refuse the burden, the parent is forced to face what they had long denied. Sometimes healing flows backward through the lineage, liberating not only the child, but also the one who first carried the wound. And even when the parent remains unconscious, the act of the empath's liberation sends ripples through the ancestral web, loosening the knots of fate, breaking patterns that might have repeated for generations. In this sense, the empath is chosen not as punishment, but as vessel of redemption. Through them, the unconscious seeks to heal itself, to bring into light what has long been hidden. It is a heavy calling, yes, but also a sacred one. And when embraced, it transforms not only the individual, but the lineage, even the collective. Do you see now why your suffering has been so intense? Why you have felt burdened beyond reason, haunted by fears and sorrows you could not name? It is because you were carrying more than yourself. And do you see now that in releasing it, in transforming it, you are not merely saving yourself, but participating in a mystery far greater? This is the hidden truth of the empath's wound. It is never only personal, it is archetypal, it is ancestral, it is cosmic. And so I say to you, do not despise your sensitivity, do not curse your wound, for it has brought you here to this moment of awakening. Without it, you would not know the depths of the soul, the mystery of the shadow, the power of integration. Without it, you would not know what it means to stand in your own light while honoring the darkness that shaped you. Let me close with a vision. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a forest at night. Behind you, the voices of your ancestors whisper, calling, burdening you with their unspoken sorrows. Before you, the forest is dark, filled with unknown shapes, shadows moving in silence. For years, you have stood here, paralyzed, carrying both the voices behind and the fears before. But now, you take a step into the darkness. The trees close around you, the shadows press in, but you walk. With each step, you realize that the shadows are not enemies but guides. They show you what you must face, what you must release, what you must integrate, and at last, after long wandering, you emerge into a clearing. The moonlight pours upon you, silver and radiant, and for the first time you feel lightness. The voices behind are silent. The shadows before are transformed, and you know you are free. This is the journey of the empath who has carried the parent's shadow. It is long, it is difficult, it is filled with tears and fire, but it is also holy, for through it, the soul awakens. Through it, the lineage heals. Through it, the collective is transformed. And through it, you discover that the wound you once despised has become the very place where the divine enters. So take courage. The burden was never yours to keep. The shadow you carried was only the threshold. Step through it, and you will find not only yourself, but the eternal mystery that has always awaited you in the depths